And we're going to go now to Simon in Bedworth, although that's in Warwickshire, I think. I think you work in London, Simon. What's your question for the Mayor?
I do. Thank you for taking my call, Sadiq. I hope you're well. Right, it's regarding these dire figures that have come out, this 20% drop in GDP. These are dire under any circumstances. It's tragic. So what I'd ask you is, do you think there should be some sort of free trade agreement between London and the EU, if not the rest of the country, because of London's strategic importance to the economy? Something needs to be done. What do you think?
Presumably it's not possible, is it? I mean, I'd like to hear your answer, but I don't want anybody getting their hopes up.
Well, Simon, can I just ask you, James mentioned you work in London. What area do you work in? What's your field?
My field is electricity distribution.
Right. Okay, so in some, I mean, James, to answer your question, it may be possible in some sectors to work closely business to business, not a trade deal. You're right. I unfortunately can't, nor would I want to, unilaterally declare independence and do my own trade deals with other cities around Europe or around the world. That's got to be done from Her Majesty's government. But we are lobbying the government in relation to some sectors, Simon. That's why I asked. So I was speaking recently with leaders of businesses in London, but also national businesses who've got offices around Europe and around the world. And some sectors are I think, more worried than others. So the financial sector, it's really important that the non-tariff barriers are removed. And it's interesting, the announcement from the government over the last 24 hours by Michael Gove, that the sort of border checks, border controls they were talking about may not now happen, which really helps with the transfer of goods. It doesn't really help in relation to the transfer of services, except it may make it easier for people to move around. So I think that there are two things. One is the deadline for us to get an extension for the transition period is the end of June. And it's quite clear the government's not going to ask for an extension. So it really is important over the next few months that the government does a trade deal, a free trade deal with the European Union. And even more so because we now know from today's ONS figures that our GDP dropped by 20% in April. And some people in the government talk about a V recovery, a bounce back. I can't see how that happens if we've got the second part of the double whammy of us leaving on the 31st of December without any deal whatsoever. And so I'm hoping cooler heads prevail in the government, but also in the EU. We need cool, calm heads in the EU and the UK to reach a deal. The bad news is the government thinks the EU needs us more than we need them. But just looking at the numbers in relation to how much we export to the EU versus how much they export to us tells me that we need them more than they need us. And so I'm hoping that the government puts aside ideology and dogma and reaches a trade deal with the EU, because we now know from the USA that the idea that the USA can step in and do a deal with us that's equivalent to the benefits of the EU just aren't there. And just a final thing on this, Simon, which you'll know as a visitor to London, is I'm speaking to a number of our vice chancellors in our universities, and they are really, really worried about the intake this October as a consequence of both COVID-19 but also Brexit. When you bear in mind, London has the largest number of foreign students of any city in the world, but also we've got domestic students deciding to defer a year. I'm really worried about the impact on higher education, which is so important to the offer London has to businesses around the world.
I think we'll move on to another question now. Before we do, what if you would put numbers on it? What do you think the likelihood is of them coming to some sort of trade agreement, however flimsy and however much remains to be concerned? What do you think the likelihood is of signatures actually being put to paper before the end of the year?
I'm confident that we'll do a deal. I think the government's, even this government's not pig-headed. I mean, the idea that Johnson, Sunak, Raab and Gove would go into next year still recovering from COVID-19, or still potentially in the midst of COVID-19, maybe in a second wave, without a deal with the EU, would be the worst form of self-harm that this country's ever seen. And so, I think they realise the importance of this. We're talking about...
Even if it means them pivoting from no deal is better than a bad deal to any deal is better than no deal.
They've got no choice for the simple reason. We're talking about levels of massive unemployment we've not seen since the 1980s. And you will know from some of your listeners that employers have now started to consult their staff on redundancies because they've been told by their government they've got to pay 20% of their wages and they can't afford to do so. And so I think the government's got to, be pragmatic, which is, I know an oxymoron when it comes to this government, be pragmatic and realise actually that I deal with EU, although they may get a few days of bad press from their friends in the media, it's worth that short-term pain for us to recover from the consequences of COVID-19.
Speaking of this government, are you engaged in constant contact with regard to coronavirus and the continuing catastrophe in that context? Are you attending Cobra meetings still? Because I know you were a bit aggrieved not to be invited to it. Pardon?
And it's really important I say this in a calm way, but I find out what the government's doing by watching their press conferences on a daily basis. I've not had contact with the Prime Minister for weeks now.
How many weeks?
At the last Cobra. So whenever the last Cobra was, I think 3-4 weeks ago, when he announced the roadmap, that was the last time I attended a Cobra. We discovered, because of my conversations with the First Ministers in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, he does meet with them. And I'd make this point in a courteous way. We, London, have a population of around 10 million. Scotland has 5 million, Wales 3 million, Northern Ireland about 1-something million. All three of those are smaller than London. Yet we aren't around the table. We aren't being engaged and consulted by the Prime Minister or the Chancellor. And it does cause me huge concern when you bear in mind on Monday, we now will have mandatory wearing of face covering, something I was talking about weeks ago. And I think this is just about better engagement, and just engage with us, work with us, because actually we've talked about the health impacts of COVID-19. But one of your early callers, Simon, was talking about the economic consequences of COVID-19. And the government's got to realise London is crucial in relation to both health and the economy of our country. That's why I'm really keen to work with them to make sure we can get through the transition and then a recovery phase going forward. I think the last time I spoke to Boris Johnson was the 10th of May. And so that gives you an idea of how little engagement, the Mayor of the capital city is having with the Prime Minister.